There are names in history that become shorthand for a specific kind of tragedy. They are no longer people, but cautionary tales, labels for human frailty. And among the most potent, most misunderstood of these is a name that echoes through 5 centuries of Spanish history, a name synonymous with madness itself. Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. The image is immediate and gothic, a queen, wild-eyed and disheveled, dragging the coffin of her handsome, dead husband across the desolate plains of Castile, refusing to let him be buried, a specter of love-crazed grief. It is a powerful, horrifying, and ultimately a deeply misleading image. It is the story that was meant to be told, the narrative crafted with meticulous cruelty by the men who controlled her life, her father, her husband, and her son. They needed her to be mad. They needed the world to see a mind so fractured, a heart so broken, that it could not possibly be trusted with the power of a throne. The true story, the one buried beneath layers of propaganda, political ambition, and masculine fear, is infinitely more complex and far more tragic. This is not the story of a madwoman. This is the story of how a brilliant, passionate, and powerful woman was systematically broken, gaslight, and imprisoned for nearly half a century, her sanity sacrificed on the altar of empire. It is a chronicle of the longest and most brutal political incarceration of a European monarch, a testament to how easily the cry of hysteria can be weaponized to silence a woman who feels too much, wants too much, and knows too much. To understand the annihilation of Queen Joanna, we must look past the caricature and see the person. The intelligent infanta, the devoted wife, the betrayed queen, and the forgotten prisoner. Joanna's story begins not in darkness, but in the blinding light of one of history's most formidable power couples, Queen Isabella I of Castile and King Ferdinand II of Aragon. Born in 1479 in the fortified city of Toledo, she was the 3rd child and 2nd daughter of the Catholic monarchs, the architects of modern Spain. This was no ordinary royal court. It was the epicenter of a nation being forged in fire and faith. The final stages of the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive the last of the Moorish kingdoms from the Iberian Peninsula, were reaching their bloody climax. The Spanish Inquisition, a tool of religious purification and social control, was extending its chilling reach. And on the horizon, a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus was petitioning for funds to sail west into the unknown. Into this crucible of immense political, religious, and military energy, Joanna was born. She was not, initially, destined for the throne. Ahead of her were her elder brother, Juan, Prince of Asturias, the precious sole male heir, and her older sister, Isabella, Queen of Portugal. Joanna, like her younger sisters Maria and Catherine of Aragon, was a strategic asset, a high-value pawn in the grand game of European dynastic diplomacy. Her education was rigorous, befitting a daughter of the famously intellectual Queen Isabella. She was tutored in the canons of Catholic theology, civil and canon law, heraldry, and genealogy. But unlike many royal women of her time, her curriculum was not merely ornamental. She displayed a staggering aptitude for languages, mastering Castilian, Leonese, Galician Portuguese, and Catalan, while also becoming fluent in French and Latin. She was not just taught, she learned deeply. Chroniclers noted her intelligence, her formal piety, and a certain quiet, melancholy introspection. She was also an accomplished musician, skilled with the clavichord, and possessed a fine singing voice. By all accounts, she was a model infanta, devout, accomplished, and dutiful. But beneath this polished surface lay a passionate, sensitive nature, a depth of feeling that was perhaps ill-suited to the cold calculus of her parents' world. She was a young woman of intense emotions in an era that had little room for them, especially in a princess whose primary function was to be bartered for an alliance. Her parents, particularly her mother, were masters of control, both of their kingdom and of their own emotions. Isabella was famously stoic, a ruler who wept for the death of her son in private, but presented a mask of iron to the world. It was a lesson in emotional suppression that Joanna, for all her intellectual gifts, would never truly master. The board was set, and the pieces were in motion. The primary threat to Ferdinand and Isabella's burgeoning Spanish power was France. To counter this, they engineered a breathtaking series of marital alliances known as the League of the Holy Roman Empire. Their heir, Juan, was married to Margaret of Austria. Their eldest daughter, Isabella, was married to the King of Portugal. Their youngest, Catherine, was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, in England. And for Joanna, the linchpin of the strategy, they arranged a marriage to the most eligible bachelor in Europe, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. He was known as Philip the Handsome, and the moniker was no exaggeration. Young, athletic, and impossibly charming, he was the ruler of the wealthy and culturally sophisticated Low Countries, Flanders, Holland, and Burgundy. This double marriage pact, with Juan marrying Philip's sister and Joanna marrying Philip, was designed to encircle France with a web of Spanish Habsburg power. In 1496, at the age of 16, Joanna's fate was sealed. She was to leave Spain, her family, and everything she had ever known, to sail to the cold, damp, and alien courts of Flanders to become the wife of a man she had never met. It was her duty. It was the price of her birth. A vast fleet was prepared to carry her and her enormous retinue to her new life. As she stood on the precipice of this departure, she was an infanta of Spain, third in line to the throne, a highly educated and deeply feeling young woman about to be thrust into the center of European power politics. She had no idea she was sailing towards her own destruction. The journey to Flanders in August 1496 was a harrowing omen of the turmoil to come. The fleet was battered by storms in the Bay of Biscay, forcing them to take refuge in England for a time. When they finally arrived in the Low Countries, the cultural collision was immediate and jarring. Joanna's new home was nothing like the austere, formal, and intensely devout court of her parents. The Burgundian court was a place of extravagant pageantry, lavish feasts, libertine morals, and complex, fluid political loyalties that prized chivalric romance over rigid piety. It was sophisticated, but to Joanna's Spanish sensibilities, it was also shockingly decadent and frivolous. She, with her somber black Spanish velvets and her retinue of stern-faced ladies-in-waiting and confessors, was seen as an exotic, severe, and rather sanctimonious curiosity. The rigid etiquette and overt religiosity of her household clashed violently with the freewheeling atmosphere of Philip's court. But the most profound shock was Philip himself. When Joanna finally met her intended husband, the chemistry was instantaneous and explosive. He was as beautiful as the rumors claimed, and she, a young woman who had lived a sheltered and emotionally repressed life, fell for him completely and irrevocably. The attraction was mutual, at least initially. So intense was their desire that they demanded to be married immediately, forgoing the planned ceremonies and consummating their union with a fiery passion that scandalized both the Spanish and Flemish courtiers. For a brief, intoxicating period, Joanna was lost in a whirlwind of obsessive love. She had been raised to see marriage as a political sacrament, a duty to God and her family. Instead, she had found a consuming passion that seemed to eclipse everything else. This, in itself, was dangerous. In the world of royal statecraft, such an all-encompassing love was not an asset. It was a vulnerability, a catastrophic weakness waiting to be exploited. The initial bliss soon curdled into a nightmare. Philip the Handsome was not just a charming prince. He was also a serial philanderer, accustomed to a constant stream of mistresses and casual affairs. He saw his passion for Joanna as a delightful novelty, but he had no intention of changing his lifestyle for his intense Spanish wife. For Joanna, who had invested her entire emotional world in this man, his infidelities were not mere dalliances. They were soul-shattering betrayals. She had given him everything, her body, her loyalty, her future, and he treated her love as a trifle. Her reaction was not the quiet, dignified suffering expected of a royal wife. It was raw, visceral, and public. She was consumed by a ferocious jealousy, erupting into furious rages, confronting his mistresses and demanding fidelity from a man to whom the concept was alien. She would scream, weep, and refuse to eat for days on end. It was during this period that the first whispers began. The Flemish courtiers, unaccustomed to such open displays of emotion and resentful of her Spanish influence, began to describe her behavior not as the understandable anguish of a betrayed wife, but as something more sinister: instability, melancholy, madness. Philip and his advisors quickly realized how useful this narrative could be. Every time Joanna reacted to his cruelty, every time she demanded her rights as his wife and duchess, her legitimate grievances could be dismissed as the ravings of a hysterical woman. He began to isolate her, dismissing her trusted Spanish attendants and replacing them with his own people, who could monitor her and report on her episodes. She was trapped in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, married to a man whose love had become an instrument of her torture. She was no longer just a wife. She was becoming a problem. And then, back in Spain, fate intervened with a series of devastating blows that would change everything. In 1497, her brother, Juan, the heir to the Spanish thrones, died suddenly. His wife, Margaret of Austria, later gave birth to a stillborn child, extinguishing that line of succession. The mantle of heir now passed to Joanna's older sister, Isabella, Queen of Portugal. But in 1498, Isabella herself died while giving birth to a son, Miguel de Paz. For a brief time, it seemed this infant boy would unite the entire Iberian Peninsula. But in 1500, little Miguel also died. The line of succession, having snaked its way through a graveyard of family members, now pointed directly, unequivocally, at Joanna. Overnight, her status was transformed. She was no longer just the Duchess of Burgundy. She was now Joanna, Princess of Asturias, the declared heir to the vast and powerful kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. This was not a promotion. It was a death sentence for her autonomy. Her mind, her emotional state, once a matter of court gossip, was now a matter of international political security. And her ambitious husband, Philip, suddenly saw his wife not just as an inconveniently jealous spouse, but as the key to a crown far greater than his own. The stage was set for the next phase of her destruction, where the private tragedy of her marriage would become a public spectacle of political usurpation. The news of her ascension to heir presumptive landed in the Flemish court like a golden apple of discord. For Joanna, it was a source of profound grief and unwanted responsibility. For Philip, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He was now, through his wife, the potential ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the world. In 1502, he and a heavily pregnant Joanna made the arduous journey to Spain to be formally recognized as heirs by the Castilian Cortes in Toledo and the Aragonese Cortes in Zaragoza. The visit was a disaster. The Spanish nobility, including Joanna's own parents, were appalled by Philip. They saw him as arrogant, frivolous, and utterly uninterested in Spanish customs or governance. He made no secret of his disdain for the country he hoped to rule, surrounding himself with his Flemish favorites and chafing under the stern gaze of Ferdinand and Isabella. Worse, he continued his philandering openly, humiliating Joanna in her own homeland. This, combined with the stress of the journey and the political pressure, exacerbated her emotional distress. She became increasingly withdrawn and melancholic, punctuated by the same jealous outbursts that had characterized her life in Flanders. Her parents, particularly her pragmatic and controlling father, Ferdinand, watched with growing alarm. They did not see a daughter suffering from the cruelty of a callous husband. They saw a future queen who was emotionally volatile and, therefore, politically unreliable. The narrative of her instability, so carefully cultivated by Philip's court, now found fertile ground in Spain. It was a narrative that served both Philip's ambitions and Ferdinand's desire to maintain control. If Joanna was unfit to rule, someone else would have to rule for her. The question was who? Unable to tolerate the staid Spanish court any longer, Philip decided to abandon his wife and return to Flanders in 1503. Joanna, who had just given birth to their son Ferdinand, was distraught at the prospect of being separated from him. She begged to go with him, but her parents, citing her recent childbirth and the dangers of winter travel, forbade it. This separation pushed Joanna to the brink. She saw it not as a matter of practical concern, but as a conspiracy to keep her from her husband, a continuation of the isolation she had endured for years. Her desperation became frantic. According to court chroniclers, sources whose accounts were undoubtedly colored by the political agendas of their patrons, she fell into a deep depression, punctuated by fits of rage. She refused to eat or sleep, spending her days staring out of a window in the direction of Flanders. In one infamous incident, she allegedly flew into a rage and had to be physically restrained from leaving the castle of La Moda, where she was being held against her will. This event, whether accurately reported or not, became a cornerstone of the case against her sanity. It was proof, her captors argued, that she could not control herself. Finally, in 1504, her mother, Isabella, allowed her to depart for Flanders. But before she left, the dying queen made a fateful addition to her last will and testament. The document confirmed Joanna as her rightful heir and Queen of Castile, but contained a devastating codicil. It stipulated that if Joanna should be unwilling or unable to govern, her father, Ferdinand, should act as regent on her behalf until her eldest son, Charles, came of age. It was a loophole born of a mother's genuine concern, a father's political cunning, and a husband's malicious whispers. The phrase, unwilling or unable to govern, was a weapon, a legal justification waiting to be deployed. It gave Ferdinand the authority to judge his own daughter's sanity, with the crown of Castile as the prize. In November 1504, the great Queen Isabella I died. At the age of 25, Joanna became Queen of Castile. It was a title she would hold for 50 years, yet she would never be allowed to truly rule for a single day. Her reign began not in a throne room, but in a gilded cage with two powerful men, her father and her husband, preparing to fight over the key. With Isabella's death, the political landscape of Spain fractured. Joanna was now Queen of Castile, and her husband, Philip, immediately began styling himself King Philip I. In Flanders, he minted coins with their joint effigies and prepared to sail to Spain to claim his power. Back in Castile, Ferdinand, citing the codicil in Isabella's will, declared himself regent. He began sending letters across Europe detailing his daughter's mental infirmities, arguing that she was wholly incapable of ruling. He painted a picture of a woman lost to a dark malady of the mind, a tragic figure who needed his paternal protection. It was a masterful piece of political theater, cloaking raw ambition in the guise of fatherly concern. The Castilian nobility, long resentful of the Aragonese Ferdinand, saw an opportunity. They largely sided with Philip, hoping the young, pliable Flemish prince would be more easily manipulated than the wily old king. For 2 years, a tense standoff ensued. Joanna was the queen, but she was a queen in name only, a pawn in a power struggle between the two most important men in her life. Both men claimed to be acting in her best interest, yet both systematically stripped her of all agency. Philip's strategy was to control her physically, keeping her by his side to legitimize his claim. Ferdinand's strategy was to control her reputation, destroying her credibility from afar. In 1506, Philip and Joanna finally set sail for Castile with a large fleet and an army of German mercenaries. Their journey was again beset by storms, forcing them to land in England, where they were the guests of Henry VII for several months. When it finally arrived in Spain, the stage was set for a confrontation. Ferdinand, seeing that the nobility had largely abandoned him for Philip, was forced to negotiate. The two men met, and in a series of agreements, they effectively carved up the kingdom between them, marginalizing the one person who was its rightful ruler. In the infamous Treaty of Villafafla, Ferdinand agreed to retire to his own kingdom of Aragon and relinquish control of Castile. But crucially, he and Philip also signed a secret second treaty, agreeing that Joanna's infirmity and suffering made her incapable of governance, and pledging to exclude her from power entirely. Philip, having secured what he wanted, then promptly betrayed Ferdinand by publishing the secret treaty, hoping to discredit his father-in-law. Joanna had been brought to Castile to assume her throne, only to find herself a prisoner of her own husband. Philip kept her isolated, surrounded by his Flemish guards, preventing her from speaking with Castilian nobles who might have supported her cause. There are accounts that she tried to assert her authority, refusing to sign documents that would ratify her exclusion from power. She understood what was happening. She knew she was being usurped. But every protest, every act of defiance, was twisted and presented as further evidence of her madness. Her righteous anger was reframed as irrational rage. Her political astuteness was dismissed as paranoid delusion. She was caught in an impossible trap. To accept her fate was to be powerless, but to fight against it was to be declared insane. This brief, toxic reign of Philip I lasted only a matter of months. In September 1506, after drinking a glass of cold water after a vigorous game of pelota in Burgos, the 28-year-old King Philip fell violently ill. Within days, he was dead. The cause was likely typhoid fever or typhus, rampant in the unsanitary conditions of the time. But in the superheated atmosphere of political intrigue, rumors of poison immediately spread, with many pointing the finger at his vengeful father-in-law, Ferdinand. For Joanna, the death of the husband she had loved so obsessively, the man who had also been her chief tormentor, was the blow from which she would never be allowed to recover. Her grief was profound and all-consuming. But this genuine, human sorrow was about to be curated, magnified, and weaponized into the defining myth of her life, the macabre journey of the mad queen and the corpse. The death of Philip the Handsome plunged Castile into a power vacuum and Joanna into the depths of a grief so profound it became legendary. What happened next is the centerpiece of the Juana la Loca myth, an episode so strange and so morbid that it has defined her image for centuries. It is here that the lines between genuine sorrow, political manipulation, and historical embellishment become almost impossibly blurred. The facts, as far as they can be reconstructed, are these. Joanna refused to allow Philip's body to be immediately interred in Burgos. She had his corpse embalmed and kept it with her in the monastery where he had died. This was not, in itself, entirely without precedent. The transport of royal bodies for burial in specific locations was common. But Joanna's behavior was marked by an intensity that her political enemies were quick to exploit. She ordered the coffin to be opened repeatedly so she could gaze upon her husband's face, a face that was already beginning to show the grim work of decay, despite the embalming. She spent hours in vigil, sometimes caressing the coffin, lost in a world of her own sorrow. The court, leaderless and terrified of the plague that had likely killed Philip, watched in a mixture of pity and horror. Her father, Ferdinand, still in Aragon, saw his opportunity. Here was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of his daughter's incapacity. No sane woman, he would argue, behaved this way. After several months, Joanna decided to move her husband's body from Burgos to the Royal Chapel of Granada, the burial place designated by her mother, Isabella, where she intended one day to lie beside him. And so began one of the most bizarre processions in European history. In the dead of winter, Joanna set out on a journey across the Castilian plains, accompanied by a retinue of nobles, clergy, and guards. The centerpiece of this strange caravan was the lead-lined coffin of Philip, drawn on carriage. The procession moved only at night. Joanna decreed that no torches would be lit by sunlight, creating a funereal, nocturnal kingdom that traversed the frozen landscape. When they stopped to rest, it was always at a monastery, and the coffin would be placed in the chapel with Joanna, keeping a constant, obsessive watch. She famously forbade any women, especially nuns, from coming near the coffin, her pathological jealousy apparently extending even beyond the grave. This journey lasted for 8 agonizing months. It was not a direct march to Granada, but a meandering, aimless-seeming trek that has been interpreted as a physical manifestation of her shattered mind. But was it? Or was there another logic at play? Some historians have argued that the procession was a deeply political act. By keeping her husband's body with her, she remained the grieving widow of a king, a potent symbol of legitimacy. As long as the coffin was above ground, Philip's reign was not truly over, and no successor could definitively take his place. It was a macabre but powerful way of holding on to power, of preventing her father from simply sweeping in and taking over. It was a political statement made through the performance of extreme grief. She was the queen, and this was her dead king, and the entire kingdom would be forced to wait upon her sorrow. But whatever her motivation, the spectacle was devastating to her reputation. The story that spread like wildfire across Spain and Europe was not of a calculating queen, but of a necrophiliac madwoman. The tales grew more lurid with each retelling. That she talked to the corpse, that she tried to kiss its decaying lips, that she was lost in a depraved fantasy. Her father's propaganda machine worked tirelessly. He was no longer trying to prove his daughter was unfit to rule. He was allowing her to prove it herself in the most public and shocking way imaginable. The grim procession finally halted in the small town of Tordesillas in 1509. It was there that her father, Ferdinand, finally arrived from Aragon to take control. He met his daughter, the grieving, exhausted queen who had dragged her husband's corpse across his kingdom. He offered her comfort. He offered her security. And then he had her imprisoned. The doors of the royal palace of Tordesillas closed behind Queen Joanna, and they would not open again for 46 years. The journey with the coffin was over, but her true descent into the abyss had just begun. The royal palace of Tordesillas, overlooking the Duero River, was not a dungeon in the traditional sense. It was a fortified palace, but for Joanna, it became a tomb in which she was buried alive. Her father, Ferdinand, now the undisputed ruler of Castile, installed her there under the pretext of caring for her. In reality, he was neutralizing her. He placed her under the guardianship of a man named Luis Ferrer, a loyal servant whose primary job was to ensure the queen remained isolated, powerless, and, most importantly, forgotten. Ferrer's methods were brutal. He controlled every aspect of her life, what she ate, who she could see, and how she was treated. He encouraged the narrative of her madness, reporting her rages and fits of melancholy back to Ferdinand. He used psychological and, according to some accounts, physical torment to keep her subdued. He restricted her access to her children and maintained an atmosphere of fear and control. Joanna was not entirely alone in her gilded cage. With her was her youngest daughter, Catherine, born after Philip's death. The child grew up in the suffocating shadow of her mother's imprisonment, her only companion a woman the world called mad. For Joanna, Catherine became her entire world, a reason to endure. But even this relationship was a tool of control. When Joanna was defiant, Ferrer would threaten to take Catherine away, a form of emotional blackmail that was cruelly effective. For years, this was Joanna's world, the stone walls of the palace, the company of her young daughter, and the oppressive presence of her jailers. She was the Queen of Castile, the co-ruler with her son, Charles, of a rapidly expanding global empire funded by the riches of the New World. Her name appeared on official documents. Her title was invoked in decrees, but she was a ghost, a legal fiction whose reality was a handful of rooms in a provincial fortress. In 1516, Ferdinand died. For a fleeting moment, there might have been hope for Joanna. But her freedom was not in the interest of the new king, her own son. Charles, who had been raised in Flanders, arrived in Spain in 1517 to claim his inheritance. He was a stranger to his mother, a cold, pragmatic teenager who spoke no Spanish. He went to Tordesillas to meet the woman whose crown he now wore. The encounter was reportedly strained. Joanna, having been isolated for years, was perhaps not the picture of regal composure. Charles, for his part, saw exactly what his grandfather had seen, not a mother to be liberated, but a political liability to be managed. He made the fateful, chilling decision to continue her imprisonment. It was more convenient, politically safer, to have a mad mother locked away than a rival queen at large. He confirmed her captivity, replacing her guardians with men loyal to him, most notably the Marquis of Denia, Bernardo de Sandoval y Rojas. The Marquis of Denia's governorship marked a new level of systematic cruelty. He believed that Joanna's madness was a form of demonic possession and that her soul could only be saved through harsh discipline. He subjected her to what he called la cuerda, a form of torment that involved strapping the victim to a chair or wall, likely a primitive form of interrogation or punishment. He openly admitted in his letters to Charles that he was using coercion and falsehoods to control the queen. He lied to her, telling her that her father was still alive, believing the shock of the truth would be too much for her. He restricted her movements even further, creating an atmosphere of total paranoia and subjugation. The Queen of Spain was being systematically tortured, physically and psychologically, with the full knowledge and consent of her son, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And yet, even in this living hell, Joanna's mind did not entirely break. There were moments of startling lucidity that terrified her captors. The most dramatic of these came in 1520 during the revolt of the Comuneros. This was a massive uprising of Castilian cities against the rule of the foreign-born Charles and his Flemish courtiers. The rebels, seeking a legitimate Spanish figurehead for their cause, marched on Tordesillas. They entered the palace, brushed aside the terrified Marquis of Denia, and came face to face with the Phantom Queen. They knelt before her, told her of their grievances against her son, and begged her to lead them, to sign documents asserting her authority as the sole ruler of Castile. This was the moment. After more than a decade of imprisonment, Joanna was presented with a real chance at freedom and power. Her response was a testament to the enduring complexity of her mind. She listened sympathetically to the rebels. She acknowledged the justice of their cause and condemned the abuses of her son's government. But she would not sign. Day after day, the rebel leaders pleaded with her, but she prevaricated. Was it the paralysis of a broken mind, unable to make a decision? Or was it the ultimate, tragic act of a mother's loyalty? To sign would be to declare war on her own son. It was a line she could not or would not cross. Her refusal to definitively lead the revolt doomed it. Eventually, Charles's royalist forces regrouped and crushed the Comuneros. Tordesillas was retaken. The rebels were executed, and Queen Joanna's last, best chance for freedom vanished forever. Her son, far from being grateful for her loyalty, saw her flirtation with the rebels as a terrifying risk. The prison doors were locked once more, this time for good. The Marquis of Denia returned, and the darkness deepened. The decades that followed the failed Comuneros revolt were a long, slow fade into oblivion. Joanna's world shrank to the confines of her chambers, her days marked by the liturgical calendar and the cruel whims of her guardians. The Marquis of Denia continued his regimen of control, his letters to Emperor Charles V providing a chilling, ongoing record of the Queen's condition. He spoke of her refusal to attend Mass, her bouts of rage, her periods of deep, silent melancholy. He described her physical decline, her neglect of personal hygiene, a common symptom of profound, long-term depression and hopelessness. To him, this was all evidence of her intractable madness. To a modern observer, it reads as the entirely predictable psychological collapse of a human being subjected to decades of solitary confinement, gaslighting, and abuse. Her daughter, Catherine, was eventually married off to the King of Portugal, leaving Joanna utterly alone. The one human connection she had nurtured in her prison was severed for the same reason her own life had been ruined: dynastic strategy. She was now approaching old age, a forgotten relic of a bygone era. Her son, Charles, one of the most powerful men on the planet, ruling an empire on which the sun never set, built his throne upon the foundation of her living entombment. He rarely visited. Why would he? Her existence was an inconvenience, a small, dark secret at the heart of his imperial glory. He continued to receive Denia's reports, sanctioning the harsh treatment, all while maintaining the public fiction of a beloved but tragically afflicted mother. As the years ground on, Joanna's physical health deteriorated dramatically. The once beautiful Infanta became a frail old woman, racked by ailments that went largely untreated. Her captors reported that her legs became covered in sores and burns, possibly from huddling too close to the fire for warmth in the drafty palace, or perhaps from a condition that was simply left to fester. Her sanity, which had flickered and fought for so long, began to truly fray under the immense weight of time and despair. She reportedly believed that a cat that had infested her rooms was a demon sent to torment her, a delusion that her guardians, steeped in the superstitions of the age, may well have shared and even encouraged. Her final years were a landscape of physical pain and mental anguish. She was tormented, filthy, and alone. In the spring of 1555, it became clear that the end was near. Joanna was over 75 years old and had been a prisoner for 46 of them. Her body was failing. In a final, belated act of piety or conscience, her grandson, Philip II, sent a Jesuit priest, the future St. Francis Borgia, to Tordesillas to administer the last rites. Borgia's account of his visit is one of the last and most poignant testaments to Joanna's state. He found a woman in extreme physical agony, but he was astonished to find her mind, in his judgment, surprisingly lucid. She was coherent. She spoke of her life, her faith, and her suffering. She was able to make her confession and receive the sacrament. Borgia left the encounter convinced that the Queen's madness had been greatly exaggerated, writing that he hoped God would make up for the lack of a grand funeral with the glory of paradise. Was this a moment of final clarity, or had she been far more sane than her jailers ever admitted? On the morning of Good Friday, April 12, 1555, as the church bells of Tordesillas tolled to mark the crucifixion of Christ, Queen Joanna of Castile died. Her long, excruciating ordeal was finally over. Her son, the Emperor Charles V, who had kept her locked away for 38 years, would himself abdicate his throne and retire to a monastery just a few months later, dying within 3 years. The death of Joanna brought no immediate reassessment of her life. The narrative crafted by her father, husband, and son was too powerful, too deeply embedded in the political firmament of Spain. She was buried with little ceremony in Tordesillas, and for a time, her legacy remained that of Juana la Loca, the textbook example of a mad queen. Her body was later moved to the Royal Chapel in Granada to be interred beside her parents and her long-dead husband, Philip, finally fulfilling the wish that had set her on her ghastly procession so many decades before. For centuries, she was a footnote, a Gothic curiosity, a romantic tragedy. The image of the woman clinging to a coffin eclipsed the reality of the queen who had been systematically erased. It was not until the 19th century, with the rise of Romanticism and a new interest in historical psychology, that scholars began to seriously question the official story. Historians gained access to the archives, to the letters between Ferdinand and Ferrer, between Charles V and the Marquis of Denia. These documents, intended to prove her madness, instead became the primary evidence for her persecution. They revealed, in the captor's own words, the campaign of isolation, coercion, and psychological torture. They showed that Joanna's symptoms, her rage, her depression, her defiance, were often direct, rational responses to the intolerable circumstances imposed upon her. Her jealousy was a reaction to blatant, humiliating infidelity. Her desperation to leave Spain was a reaction to being held against her will. Her refusal to eat was a recognized symptom of deep depression, or perhaps a form of protest. Her final refusal to lead the Comuneros was not madness, but perhaps the agonizingly sane choice of a mother protecting her son, even at the cost of her own freedom. Modern historians and medical experts have posited a range of retrospective diagnoses, severe clinical depression, bipolar disorder, psychosis, or perhaps a form of schizoaffective disorder. It is possible she did suffer from a genuine, underlying mental illness, one that was horribly exacerbated by her circumstances, by the trauma of so many deaths, by the betrayals of her husband, and by the relentless pressure of her position. But this is almost beside the point. Whether she had a clinical illness or not, the critical fact is that her condition was deliberately weaponized against her for political gain. Her suffering was not treated as a sickness to be healed, but as a condition to be exploited. The diagnosis of madness was a political tool wielded with chilling precision by three of the most powerful men in European history to dispossess a woman of her crown, her autonomy, and her identity. The story of Joanna of Castile is, therefore, far more than a personal tragedy. It is a profound and disturbing case study in the pathology of power. It demonstrates how vulnerable any individual, no matter how highborn, can be when their reality is controlled and defined by those who hold power over them. It is a story about gaslighting on a geopolitical scale. Joanna was told she was mad for feeling the things any sane person would feel in her situation. Her grief was called necrophilia. Her anger was called hysteria. Her intelligence was called paranoia. She was trapped in a prison of interpretation, where her every action was fed into a pre-existing narrative of insanity. Her life stands as a brutal monument to the historical silencing of women. She was a queen in an age that was not ready for a woman to wield such power with such passion. Her intense emotionality, which might have been admired as sensitivity in a poet, was seen as a disqualifying liability in a ruler. She was punished not just for what she did, but for who she was, a woman who felt too deeply, loved too fiercely, and grieved too openly in a world run by cold, calculating men. Ultimately, the question of whether Joanna was truly mad is the wrong question. It continues the very framework of her persecutors, placing her on trial once again. The more vital, more honest question is how she was treated, and the answer is undeniable. She was the victim of a calculated, lifelong conspiracy to usurp her power. She was betrayed by her husband, imprisoned by her father, and abandoned by her son. For 46 years, she was denied her freedom, her children, her throne, and her very identity. The story of Juana la Loca is not the story of a madwoman who lost a kingdom. It is the story of a queen who was driven to the edge of madness because her kingdom was stolen from her. Her tragedy is not that she lost her mind. It is that she was systematically and deliberately erased, her name becoming a cautionary whisper, a chilling reminder that for those in power, the most convenient truth is often the most brutal lie.